All right, we'll be in Daniel 6 here in just a minute. So hopefully we'll finish out this chapter tonight. If not, it should get the majority of it. And then next week we will begin introducing and thinking about apocalyptic literature. And the reason we're doing that is because the whole second half of the book is that. And it is without going into all of it, I guess, right now, the Bible is certainly the Word of God, but the Bible is also literature. It is a written document. It's literary, and it has different literary forms. And in the same way you and I would read certain literary forms, what type of literature they are influence how we understand them. The same thing is true with the literary forms of Scripture. And apocalyptic is a literary form. And there is a whole body of writings that we have to draw from, not just what we have in Scripture, but also extra biblical accounts. So outside, and I only printed about 25 of these because I wasn't sure how many people would actually want to do it. This is written by a friend of mine who is an instructor at Bear Valley Bible Institute in Denver, and it's kind of an introduction to apocalyptic literature. It's comparing the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. I think it's 18 pages. That's double space. That's the way we write these things. We have to, so they can edit them and make them look the way they're supposed to in book form and stuff like that. So anyway, he has written this. I would encourage you to read through this before we get in here. And before we get into all of the apocalyptic study, the first thing is if we expect to understand everything immediately when it comes to apocalyptic language, we're going to be frustrated because that's not going to happen, okay? It takes a while to get how they communicate. And that's not a shot on anyone's integrity. That is people who, I remember the first time I was introduced to it in school at a more critical level. It just takes time. And so I would encourage you to go through this because he does talk about it, and it's broken down in a very easy and followable fashion. And so if you read something, if you would just read and think through about 3 pages of this a day, you'd be ready by the time we get to class next week. And quit worrying about understanding everything. Okay? You have to learn, when you're beginning anything, you have to catch what you can catch. Okay? And not worry about what you're missing. And furthermore, in apocalyptic literature, it's very different, say, from the letters of Paul. The letters of Paul, we're looking at every single detail because it's polemic in its nature. He's structuring an argument. When you're dealing with apocalyptic, you're dealing with images. He's not asking you, when a movie comes on or you're watching a show, you don't ask yourself why the rocker is sitting in the corner. You just assume it's there as a prop, right? Okay, in apocalyptic literature, you've got stuff that's going to be thrown on the stage, and it doesn't really mean anything. It's there as a prop. It's there to kind of see the image of what's going on. And so learning how to to think that way and study that way is a little bit different. And so we will try and introduce it and walk through it. And plus, if you go through this and you have questions, we can address them when we get in here. And we'll spend a couple of weeks at least and just kind of see how we're working through it. And that's the other thing, too, when it comes to this. I know in auditorium classes, many times we don't like to ask questions, but you're going to have to ask them. I don't know how else. And like, I'm used to being the class moron, and I'll ask the question. Like, I don't care. I'm not embarrassed to ask a question I don't know the answer to. And I don't care if that makes me look stupid. I would rather know what it means than sit there and look intelligent to other people and still remain ignorant. So that's something we're going to have to learn how to do. If something doesn't make sense, then we've got to stop so we can make sure it makes sense and then take our steps forward. Otherwise, it's going to be boring and frustrating and everything else under the sun. And so it is an endeavor. And so we're doing it on a small scale now because I think I've given you the plan before. A number of people have asked about studying Revelation. We'll see how you feel after we're done. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, you may just be kind of tired of dealing with apocalyptic literature, and it's a whole lot easier to study chapters 7 through 12 than it is to study 22 chapters of it, okay? So we'll just kind of play it by ear. We can insert short studies in between and do what we need to do to make sure we're not burnt out with what's going on. So that's that. They're all right here. Like I said, there are 25 more. I can print them from my iPad in a matter of seconds if we need more. So they'll be out there on that table in the foyer, and someone can have this one. I just grabbed it from that stack. Okay, chapter 6, we are picking up in verse 10. This is the Medo-Persian Empire, and with all the different guardians of the empire, or translated satraps, Daniel is part of the three innermost circle to the king, and he is about to be elevated to the highest of that circle. And so they're trying to find a way to entrap him so that he does not gain that position out of professional jealousy, and I think probably out of some nationalistic jealousy and xenophobia and things along those lines. And so they have tricked the king. They've played on his ego by saying that, everybody should make a request of you for the next 30 days, and whoever doesn't will be thrown into a den of lions. And consequently, the reason why they would punish people with a den of lions as opposed to a fiery furnace is because they worshipped fire, and they did not use that as a means of execution. So that's why you see a little change between the Babylonian and the Medo-Persian forms of execution. I mean, none of them are pleasant, but that does explain the difference. So the king signs it, and he's quickly going to realize he's made a terrible mistake, and he's had somebody lead him. And if you've ever had somebody use you, you know how incredibly frustrating this is, right? When somebody is, in my experience, somebody's asking me questions, and I come to find out later they're not really asking me questions because they want to know what the answer to the question is. They're asking me questions so that they can take my answer and use it as ammunition against somebody else. And if I would have known that, we would have talked about something completely different. We wouldn't have been talking about their question. We'd have been talking about the condition of their heart. And so being used is not something that is fun. And so they have set him up and led him, and he's about to understand the consequences of that as he sees it. So the writing has been signed, and in verse 10 it says, when Daniel knew the document had been signed, all right, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. And so his upper chambers, we've talked about this before. You see it with David's trouble with Bathsheba. You see it in other places. Even in chapter 4, when Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of his house, the roof of their houses were kind of like our back porches. It's where they would be. And so he's up there, and his windows are open toward Jerusalem. Now, it doesn't seem that, based upon the last statement of the verse, as he had done previously, it doesn't seem that he's like opening the windows and just trying to put it in people's face. These windows are open because they're always open toward Jerusalem, and that's when he prays. And that's the difference. When we first introduced this study, we're talking about compassionate conviction. And that is, you can be convicted and still be compassionate all at the same time. And you can be convicted and stand for what is right without being a jerk. And without just throwing it in somebody's face. We talked about it with the three young men in the fiery furnace. They weren't out making a protest. Somebody just saw them. Okay? Daniel doesn't go up and yell louder in his prayer and open his windows and do it in front of everybody to try and parade it. I know what the king said, but I'm not submitting, and that's it. That's not what Daniel is doing. And if we read that in this text, we're reading something into it that is not here. Daniel is now an older man. Daniel is doing what Daniel always does. That's it. Okay? So it's not like he's going to prove his point to somebody or stick it to somebody. He's just being the same servant that he's always been. And so he's praying toward Jerusalem, which you remember Solomon, when we studied that, he talked about praying toward Jerusalem, 1 Kings 8:46-53. So then he got down on his knees, which the most common custom was usually to stand, but he gets down on his knees, which is a more humbling posture. And if you've never actually prayed on your knees, I would encourage you to try that and just kind of see what we're talking about there. So he does that 3 times a day. Okay? It would seem that this comes from for an example, Psalm 55:17 says, "Morning, noon, and night, I will lift up my eyes in prayer to you." And so 3 times a day, the hours of prayer, when you run into them, it was common that they would pray in the morning, the time of the morning sacrifice and the time of the evening sacrifice, which was regulated under the law. Those would be regular hours of prayer. You also see, who is it? Peter and John, when they go to the temple in Acts 3. Is that right? Peter and John, maybe. 2 of them, they're going up to the temple at the hour of prayer. They heal the lame man. Yeah. And so they're going at prescribed hours of prayer, not prescribed by the law, but simply customs. Okay? And so 3 times a day, it says he prayed and he gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. And we talked about this a little bit, about the importance of having spiritual discipline. Spiritual discipline. And I don't know, a couple of years ago in the library class, we spent a few weeks talking about spiritual disciplines. That spirituality, it's kind of interesting because we look at, say, a healthy lifestyle, or we look at financial success, or we look at career success, or we look at all these other things, and we say, well, you got to be disciplined. There are certain things you got to do if you want to achieve your end result. If you want to be a spiritual person, you got to be disciplined. It's not a magic thing that either you got it or you don't. It's, are you willing to do the things that are necessary to cultivate it? Are you willing to pray when you don't feel like it? Are you willing to open your Bible when you don't feel like it? That's discipline. Being able to realize my feelings are just feelings. They don't dictate reality, and they don't dictate what I do. I do what I do, regardless of how I feel about it at that moment, because our feelings are going to fluctuate. Our feelings are very fickle. And so we do those things. And so when he's praying 3 times a day, I can guarantee you Daniel felt frustration in prayer. I can guarantee you he felt like there were times when it wasn't working, that every emotion you can imagine, I can guarantee you he felt it. But he kept coming back to it, because that's what you do. So he's doing his normal thing, and there's a statement later that will speak more to that I've got on the PowerPoint in just a little bit. It says, "Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God," which, by the way, he gave thanks. Not just praying, but he also is giving thanks, and he is giving thanks in a foreign land. He hasn't seen his homeland in 70 years. It says, "Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, 'O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days of you, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?' The king answered and said, 'The thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked.'" And we've talked about that. And so that law literally could not be revoked. They could write another law, even in Esther. When he gives the law that says the Jews will be slaughtered on this day, he tells Esther, I can't change that law. I can't rescind that law. The only thing I can do is write a new law that says they can defend themselves. Okay? So there was no changing. So then they answered and said before the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah." Notice that. Notice how they describe him. Don't miss it. He's one of the exiles from Judah. Not, the guy who works with us, our coworker, our boss. They're still looking at him differently. They're still viewing him and labeling him through a lens that is less than favorable. And listen to how they frame it. He pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. So you see how they're framing things. And it's an important lesson in communication because the reality is not everybody that's communicating to you is honest. And not everybody that's communicating to you is framing the situation the way it really happened. They're framing the situation the way they want you to see it. That's why it's foolish to take one side of any story and run. It's absolutely foolish. Okay? Listen to how they're framing him. First of all, he's one of the exiles of Judah. So you can kind of see the seed being planted there of, he's subversive. He's not one of us. Then, he pays no attention to you. I mean, is that really an accurate description? I'd say he pays attention to the king. He serves at the king's pleasure. He does everything the king wants him to do. There's one area of exception. Don't you think that's far different than saying he doesn't pay any attention to you? Nor the injunction that you have signed. He doesn't care about your law. He's setting a dangerous precedent with his position that if he doesn't pay attention to you, other people will be emboldened not to pay attention to you. This is the same thing that happened in Esther chapter 1, by the way. When Vashti refuses to come in before the king and the other nobles say, well, look, all the other women are going to hear it and they're going, you've got to punish her. You've got to make an example out of her. So be careful how people frame things. And don't be naive enough to believe, just because a thing is framed a certain way, that's exactly how it went down. Okay? The Proverbs talk about this quite a bit, one of which is, there's a guy who, I'm summarizing, this is my revised version, there's a guy who comes along and says, this is what happened, and it sounds right until another comes along and examines him. Another person comes along who knows the situation and asks further questions and for clarification, and then the whole story starts coming out. Okay? But this is the way some people are wired. This is what they do. They always work angles. So then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. He's angry at himself. He's frustrated at himself. He knows he's been played. And so now he's thinking about how to reverse it. And so he labored till the sun went down to rescue him, spent all day trying to figure out something he could do. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. So as I'm reading this, there's this part of me that's just looking at these guys and it's just angry. Like, conniving weasels is what I think of. Like just a weasel. Like, if I'm just being honest, my natural reaction is just to shove them away. Like, shut up and go somewhere. That's my natural inclination toward people like this. Just go somewhere. All right? Yes, I know what, it's like they're keep reminding him, oh, king, you got to do this. Just be quiet. You got me, okay? You won this one. Just go away. I know I've got to punish him. So the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. Now, notice, if you contrast this with Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3 and verse 15 asked them, who's the God that can deliver you from my hands? The king here says, maybe your God will deliver you. There's a more favorable approach that is going on. And the stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. So, the typical lion's den, it would seem, is not just necessarily a pit where they've dropped some lions down. It would seem, according to some people, and I think it makes a lot of sense, that there is kind of a ramp by which you can walk people down and let them in. And so they take Daniel down, and you kind of see an older man, and they're leading him down to this disgusting display of execution. My mind immediately goes to the Holocaust and the execution of undesirables. And if you've ever seen pictures and depictions of that, you know what I'm talking about. And so they're leading him down here, but the king is still hoping that the God that he serves will deliver him. And so they roll this stone into place over the top, over the mouth, and they seal it. Multiple ways they could have sealed it. Not much different than, you can go as simple as when police seal a crime scene on a door, they'll put the seal on the side. They'll take basically a piece of paper and tape it over so that the only way you can open the door is to tear the seal, so it can tell you if somebody's been in or out. And so that's kind of what's going on here. They're sealing it. Some people think that they would have taken wax and put it around the edge. So if you actually try and move the stone, the seal will be broken. And so very similar to the way Jesus' tomb was sealed in Matthew 27. So they put him in, and then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him. Sleep fled from him. You can see that there's something interesting and admirable about him, because he refuses to not think about what he's done. You can see him, he's consciously making himself deal with the consequences of his own decision. He could have had people come in and say, okay, it happened, I can't change it, let's just forget about it. That's not what he does. He refuses to eat. He won't have any entertainment brought. No music is going to be played to try and soothe him. No other meetings, no other anything to try and keep his mind away from it. He's just going to deal with the consequences of what he's done. It says, then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. Okay? Kings did not cry out in a tone of anguish about anything. It's like he's hoping against hope, to borrow a biblical phrase. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? And you can see him, he says it. And he almost knows nothing is going to be said in return. Like you can see him closing his eyes and just listening intently. Like he just knows nothing is going to be said in return. And then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. And you can almost feel like a weight. You can feel the weight for the king coming off of him. It worked out. It did not happen. He was able to survive. O king, live forever. Look at that. The guy threw him in a den of lions. Daniel, are you alive? What's his answer? In Southern vernacular, yes, sir, I'm here. Not you jerk. You disgusting example of a human being. Yes, sir. I'm alive. He said, my God sent his angel, the same way he did in chapter 3, verses 25 and 28. And he shut the lions' mouths. And this is what the writer of Hebrews means when he summarizes other actions of faith, and he says, through faith they stopped the mouths of lions, Hebrews 11 and verse 33. And they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and before you, O king, I have done no harm. And so he does. Now notice he's respectful to the king, but he also stays true to the fact that I didn't do anything to deserve this. Okay? This happened not because, the reason I'm delivered is not because I was guilty of breaking your decree. It happened because breaking your decree was the right thing to do. And God was willing to deliver me for that. And so the king said, was exceedingly glad, verse 23, and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. He was willing to go, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. He was willing to give his life. There was no guarantee that he would be, but there was no guarantee that God would deliver him, but he simply was willing to resign himself to God's choice. And the king commanded of those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they were brought and cast into the den of lions, they and their children and their wives. And they reached at the bottom of the den. The lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Okay? So there are a few things to think about here. First of all, people say, why the wives and the children and other things? Well, I don't know that I can give you every satisfactory answer, but it is a common practice. Achan in Joshua 7, when he sins, he and all of his family are killed along with him. Were they complicit in it? Perhaps. I don't know. The same thing happens in Esther. Haman, and those connected to him are executed. There's a time in the reign of David, I don't remember exactly, it just kind of came to me. Have to be after 2 Samuel 9, because Mephibosheth is spared. But basically, there's harm come to the land of Israel, and that's because Saul had committed an evil, and he had to have some of his descendants executed so God would lift that curse that had come upon them. So it is a common practice. Further, one of the things we see is that the lions did not choose. It's not like the lions chose and said, you know what, we're not hungry, and so, Daniel, we're just going to let you live. Because if that were true, then all of them wouldn't die immediately. It wasn't the fact that they weren't hungry. As a matter of fact, this is... So Josephus, a lot of people, you've probably heard a lot about him. He's a Jewish historian in the first century. And so he's written several books. They're all usually compiled in a book that looks something like this, and translated, of course. And in that, and part of these books, the Antiquities of the Jews is what I'm looking at, he offers a summary / commentary on basically the whole Old Testament from his perspective. And this is what he says in his Antiquities in Book 10, paragraph 260. He says, now when his enemies saw that Daniel had suffered nothing, which was terrible, they would not own that he was preserved by God. That is, his enemies refused to accept it was an act of God and by his providence. But they said that the lions had been filled full with food, and on that account it was, as they supposed, that the lions would not touch Daniel nor come to him, and this they alleged to the king. And so this is Josephus' interpretation. Whether it happened or not, Josephus had a flair for the dramatic, okay? But it is a Jewish tradition. It says, but the king, out of the abhorrence of their wickedness, gave order that they should throw in a great deal of flesh to the lions, and when they had filled themselves, he gave further order that Daniel's enemies should be cast into the den, that he might learn whether the lions, now that they were full, would touch them or not. And it appeared plain to Darius, after the princes had been cast to the wild beast, that it was God who preserved Daniel. For, that is, this is how he came to that conclusion, the lions spared none of them, but tore them all to pieces. as if they had been very hungry and wanted food. I suppose, therefore, it was not their hunger which had been little before satisfied with the abundance of flesh, but the wickedness of these men that provoked them to destroy the princes. For if it so pleased God that wickedness might, by even the irrational creatures, be esteemed a plain foundation for their punishment. And so basically the men who accused him said, it's not fair. Somebody fed the lions beforehand, and that's why they didn't eat him. Well, Josephus, there may have been a rumor that was circulating about the time Josephus is writing, and so he may be addressing that rumor in his commentary. Yes, sir.
How would they try to just take away from the miracle that throws in the oven 7 times, that heats the oven 7 times,
Mm-hmm.
and it kills the people that throw them in it?
Right. Well, that was a different, with a different kingdom and different circumstances, and on that one, I don't think they doubted the miracle. On this side, I think these guys are trying to, they're trying to save their neck, basically. I think they know what's coming. So, all right. It's a good question, though. Anybody else? Okay. So it says, then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages. This is perfectly parallel to chapter 3, when Nebuchadnezzar also writes a decree. And says, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree in all my royal dominion. People are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. And so he basically sends forth and says this God is to be respected. And in many places, there was kind of a list of gods that nations had that were permissible to be worshipped. They had been empire approved, basically. You run into that in Acts. What is it, Acts? 16 or 17. He's there. I'm thinking of a. Anyway, my brain is not working tonight. So, anyway, they accuse them of following a new religion, which is a very important political crime, and that's because Christianity was not a Roman-approved religion. It was still considered part of the Jewish faith at that time. There's not a break that seems to be identifiable between Judaism and Christianity until much later. So it says, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And we talked about this last week. The way the word and could and maybe should be translated is that is. That is, Darius is another name for Cyrus the Persian or Cyrus the Great. And so there are a couple of statements here I want us to look at very quickly when we think about some of the things in this chapter. This is dealing with God choosing to deliver Daniel. It says, when God intervenes, it is to accomplish his purposes, not ours. The point of these stories is not to expect God's miraculous intervention, but to demonstrate to God's people that he is present with them and with those willing to suffer death rather than betray their allegiance to and reliance on the God of heaven. God calls some to win by living, others he calls to win by dying. But in life or death, God rules, and we are called to serve him. The simple truth is this. We look at all the miraculous deliverance stories in Scripture. They are exceptions. They are not rules. The rule is that most times God allows his people to die for their faith. That's the rule. That's not the rule we want to hear. But you look at the text in front of you and you look at it closely, you'll see that that is the rule. And that they don't set conditions that says, God, you have to deliver me or else. They're willing to resign themselves and say, he can. I know he can. Now, whether he will, I don't know. But either way, they're willing to give themselves for him. And we we look at that and some people say, how can they do that? Well, it goes back to what we talked about Sunday. Is God just an idea to you, or is he real? All right. And then it says, Daniel 6 shows us a man who spent his lifetime choosing to be faithful to his God. When the decree came down forcing him to choose sides, he didn't flinch. He maintained his faithfulness. He maintained his faithfulness forged through many years of religious habits. Okay? So someone writes a decree, the king writes a decree and says, you can't pray. Daniel looks at it and goes, that's nice. And he just keeps doing what he does. Okay? Now look, we can take a lot of lessons from this. One of which was, in my second job, I don't remember which president was elected. I remember it was not the one that people in that congregation wanted elected. And my word, you would have thought the world was ending. I mean, absolutely thought it was coming to an end. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I tried to answer them nicely and just say, I'm going to go down to that office over there. I'm going to do my job. If you're letting this control you, you're in trouble. And one of the things we're going to see, it may be, no, it's not going to be this one, it would be the next one. He says, in the face of adversity, he did the boldest thing he could. He got down on his knees and he prayed. And one of the reasons why that is so bold is here's the statement. Indeed, prayer is more subversive to earthly authority than rebellion. For rebellion acknowledges the power of the state, while prayer appeals to a higher power whose ultimate will cannot be thwarted. You see what he's saying? Rebellion, uprising, crying out, throwing fits. What you're doing is acknowledging that they have too much authority and they're wielding it over you. Prayer is going above their head. Prayer is not, so when I'm constantly doing this and rebelling and complaining about all these things that are going on, I'm saying you've got all this authority over me, and I'm almost saying that you're the supreme authority. You're controlling me. When I pray, I look at him and go, I'll talk to your supervisor. Thanks. I'm going this way. I'm going to the one to whom you are accountable. And that's why it's considered more powerful and more subversive. Because the God who controls the nations, which is what this whole book is about, can do more. So, we will stop there. I thought I had a slide. I thought I had a different one here. That's not it either. There it is. So, and I know we're over a little bit, but when you look at early Christian art, I know, don't go to sleep on me. But if you look at early Christian art, in catacombs, places where they were buried underground, things along those lines, one of the works of art that you will see in some of them is the picture of Daniel in the lion's den. Because Daniel in the lion's den became a picture of resurrection. You had Daniel and Jesus both being persecuted by authorities, both being sent down into the ground, being sealed into a tomb, basically. Daniel was alive when he went in, but for all intents and purposes, that's a tomb. He's going to die there if things go normally. And then early in the morning, as the women come to the tomb in Matthew 28:1, and then the king comes to the tomb, and it's opened, and he's alive. And so the early Christians used this, and I'm not going to say they interpreted Daniel 6 to be picturing the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I'm going to say they used it and they saw parallels between it and what Jesus had done, and they put it on the walls at graveyards to inspire hope in people. That just as God had done that to Daniel, he had done it in Jesus, and he would do it for the people who were buried there. So that's Daniel 6, and next week we'll launch into the other subject matter.